So there's this idea that science is the best way, if not the only way, to reliably gain knowledge about reality. The explain it to me like I'm five version of this argument is usually an appeal to the outcomes of science. Well, science gave us planes and penicillin and cell phones, so obviously it's the best way to understand the world. And they're right, we do have planes. A slightly more sophisticated argument might appeal to the methods of science. Science works because it's objective. It separates fact from belief. It's not swayed by emotions or tradition. And hey, science is awesome. Me and science go way back, actually. I love science. But what if I told you that there are real, documented, sometimes world-changing cases where rigorous rational science was only able to find some truth with the help of something unscientific, something pseudoscientific, even? Well, it's true. And if you stick around long enough for me to tell you about it, you might find that the line between science and pseudoscience is a little fuzzier than you thought. To stave off allegations of sensationalist clickbait, let's start by setting some operational definitions. What exactly do I mean when I say pseudoscience beat science? Well, by pseudoscience, I don't necessarily mean something that presents itself as scientific but is provably wrong, like phrenology, for example. I mean it in the sense of the demarcation problem. For millennia, philosophers have been arguing about what exactly counts as science, and in the context of this debate, other knowledge systems that also attempt to explain phenomena are pseudoscience. But using that line as a definition kind of feels like putting the cart before the horse, so let's try to pin down science. What I'm referring to when I say science in this video is not the generic process of fact-finding through observation. Instead, I'm referring to the particular tradition of post-Enlightenment Western science that is oftenly touted as uniquely capable of producing useful and reliable knowledge. So when I say pseudoscience beats science, what I mean is that some knowledge system considered to be non-scientific produced information that both has utility and would have been inaccessible to a purely scientific approach. So please don't overinterpret me. I'm not saying all pseudoscience is real and good, nor am I saying Western science is bad and useless. I'm saying that science as we generally think of it has limitations, and can in fact be improved upon by engaging with other ways of knowing. Now that we got the semantics out of the way, I'm going to tell you 3 stories of pseudoscience beating science. One about indigenous agricultural practices and how certain plants grow, one about traditional Chinese medicine and the cure for malaria, and one about the very real phenomenon of voodoo death. And I'll tie it all together with a discussion of what these stories tell us about the pursuit of knowledge. As a note, while I am a trained scientist, my background is not in ecology, chemistry, or physiology because I don't do squishy stuff science. So if any of you viewers with more expertise notice I made a mistake, please feel free to correct me in the comments. I'll include any necessary corrections in the document linked below, along with my references, which will also be shown on screen. And with that, I think we're ready to get started. Yes, I'm doing a list video, yes, it is a recession indicator, and yes, it's still gonna be a banger. In the early 2000s, a PhD student in ecology named Lori Reed proposed a thesis testing whether traditional indigenous harvesting methods could help restore the declining population of a sacred plant. Most of her committee dismissed the idea outright. Her dean literally told her, quote, "Anyone knows that harvesting a plant will damage the population. You're wasting your time." Nevertheless, she persisted, and while her findings left the once skeptical thesis committee stunned, they came as no surprise to the indigenous elders whose knowledge she'd confirmed. Sometimes, harvesting a plant actually does increase its population. Reed was introduced to this ancestral wisdom by her thesis advisor, Robin Wall Kimmerer, a plant ecologist and member of the Potawatomi Nation whose work in environmental sustainability leverages her experience in both scientific and indigenous knowledge. And the plant in question is wingashk, or sweetgrass, which is used by indigenous nations across North America for ceremonial smudging, herbal medicine, and basket weaving. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer describes accompanying an elder who shows her the rituals of its harvest. You don't use the first plant you see, you leave a gift for the plant you do harvest from, and you don't take more than half of what's there, all informed by knowledge passed down across generations. And the hypothesis Kimmerer pitched to Reed was based on that same tradition. In the words of her elder, if we use a plant respectfully, it will stay with us and flourish. If we ignore it, it will go away. If you don't give it respect, it will leave us. More specifically, the question Kimmerer was inspired to investigate was whether harvesting sweetgrass respectfully might not harm a population the way other harvest methods do. The elder she learned from had always harvested by cutting the blades of sweetgrass, but she had heard of others who instead pull it up by the roots and thought maybe that was to blame for the dwindling populations. So she and her student designed an experiment. They designated plots of sweetgrass in a remote area to be harvested either by cutting or by pulling, and of course, a set of control plots which were not harvested at all. They spent 2 years from the first harvest monitoring the sweetgrass's response, each year harvesting half of the grass from the non-control plots, and in the end, the results were clear. It didn't actually matter whether the sweetgrass was harvested by cutting or pulling. The plots from both of those groups were all thriving, ending the study with larger populations than they started with. It was only the control plots that were dying, the ones that hadn't been touched at all. So regardless of the method, the ancestral knowledge was right. If you use it respectfully, it will flourish. If you ignore it, it will go away. Now, maybe it doesn't actually seem like pseudoscience really beat science here. After all, they literally used a controlled experiment to prove their results. And when the hypothesis was put to the test, science did just as well as the ancestors, right? Well, that may be true, but we have to ask whether someone coming from a purely scientific perspective would have investigated this question to begin with. Remember what that dean said? Anyone knows that harvesting a plant will damage the population. In other words, this is not something a real scientist would bother studying. Like I said before, science isn't just learning things by observing. It's a particular tradition, and a foundational value of that tradition is objectivity, in the sense of observer independence. The person doing science should have nothing to do with the results they're finding. Now, this feels intuitive as a thing to aim for. Of course, it's valuable to try mitigating those pesky biases that humans are so prone to, and there is a certain rhetorical authority to claims that supposedly transcend perspective. But as the advent of quantum mechanics has showed us, if we want to understand our reality, sometimes we're going to be a part of the equation. In the context of ecology, the idealized view from nowhere manifests in the assumption of human non-interference being the default state of natural ecosystems. Here's Kimmerer's explanation. The thesis committee's predictions for sweetgrass were consistent with their Western science worldview, which sets human beings outside of nature and judges their interactions with other species as largely negative. They had been schooled that the best way to protect a dwindling species was to leave it alone and keep people away. But the grassy meadows tell us that, for sweetgrass, human beings are a part of the system, a vital part. Something that's been kind of difficult for me to capture in my retelling of Kimmerer's story is the deeply relational way sweetgrass is conceptualized in indigenous knowledge. You don't just take sweetgrass, you greet it. You ask it for permission to harvest. You offer it a gift. Even the titular act of braiding sweetgrass is relational, something done communally, connecting the person holding the strands to the person braiding them. All that ceremonial relationality isn't just decoration. It echoes the fundamental truth of the plant and was essential to how that truth was found and sustained across generations. So yes, the scientific method validated the ancestral knowledge in a sense. But that validation would not have had reason to happen without the knowledge already existing and Kimmerer being around and well-versed enough in both areas to bridge them. So it's not just that the science caught up. It was that the pseudoscience led it somewhere it wouldn't have gotten to on its own. This this is artemisinin, and it's arguably the most important compound in the treatment of malaria worldwide. To give a sense of how significant it is, the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded to Yu Tu, the pharmaceutical chemist credited with its discovery. But while Tu was the first to isolate and name this compound, she didn't really discover it as a cure for malaria. She just continued the work of Chinese medicine practitioners who identified it 1,500 years earlier. The story of this ancient cure's introduction to modern medicine starts in the 1960s, when, worried about the rate at which they were losing troops in Vietnam to malaria, the Chinese government established Project 523 to develop a treatment that didn't have the debilitating side effects of existing anti-malarials. The project, which was named for the date it was established, consisted of two parallel efforts. One team using modern pharmaceutical chemistry, and one using traditional Chinese medicine. Tu led the latter team in an extensive review of traditional remedies, examining over 2,000 herbal preparations and testing more than 380 extracts from around 200 different plants. And eventually they found a promising lead. Qinghao, or Artemisia annua, had long been used as a fever remedy in China, and an extract from the plant showed strong anti-malarial effects in early tests. However, when Tu's team tried to replicate the result, it stopped working. So they went back to the literature and found a description of how the herb was used in a 4th century medical text. A handful of Qinghao immersed with 2 liters of water, wring out the juice, and drink it all. This led Tu to realize that the heat involved in the extraction method they had been using may have been damaging the active ingredient, and inspired her to try a lower temperature extraction method instead. And that was the critical breakthrough. When tested on malaria-infected mice and monkeys, the low temperature extraction from Qinghao was 100% effective. The path from that moment to global adoption wasn't exactly smooth. The Cultural Revolution in China posed logistical challenges to running clinical trials, so Tu and her team literally took the extract themselves to prove it was safe for humans. But once they could finally run tests on malaria patients, the results were undeniable. Consistent, rapid recovery, even where existing drugs had failed. In 1977, Tu published artemisinin's chemical structure. In 1981, she presented her findings at a WHO meeting, and from then on, this Qinghao derivative drug would be used to treat malaria around the world. Now, one lesson from this story is similar to what we saw in the last one. While the scientific method was used to translate the old knowledge into modern contexts, scientists working from a purely Western perspective would have had no reason to test this particular herb without a tip-off from the ancients. And even if they had, the standard extraction methods of today would have damaged the critical compound, and the irreproducibility that Tu initially experienced would have undermined its validity as a treatment. But like the bias towards thinking objectively rather than relationally in the Sweetgrass story, the interface of traditional and Western medicine here reveals another bias of science, and that is the tendency towards reductionism. Reductionism is basically the approach of considering a phenomenon in terms of its most fundamental parts. If you understand the smaller pieces, you have all the information you need to logically build up your understanding of the bigger system. In Western medicine, this looks like research focusing on how this one specific compound affects the statistical average of this one specific symptom in a population. And the success of modern pharmacology is a testament to the utility of that approach. But in Eastern systems like Chinese medicine, the question's often more like, how does this plant as a whole affect this human as a whole? In a retrospective on her discovery, Tu credits this holistic approach to the identification of not just Qinghao, but a whole slew of traditional herbs that form the basis of modern pharmaceutical treatments. The use of a single herb for the treatment of a specific disease is rare in Chinese medicine. Generally, the treatment of a patient's syndrome and a prescription comprises of a group of herbs specifically tailored to the syndrome. The rich correlations between syndromes and prescriptions have fueled the advancement of Chinese medicine for thousands of years. So just like objectivity in our last story, the scientific tendency towards reductionism would have likely kept this cure out of reach. But what's unique here is that Western science wouldn't just fail to find the cure, it had almost erased the knowledge system that contained it. Actually, I don't know if it's quite unique in that respect, but it's at least a different version. So in the early 20th century, traditional medicine in China was systematically sidelined by reformers eager to emulate the technological dominance of the West. Like, anything that didn't align with modern science, herbalism, acupuncture, whatever, was relegated to superstition. And it wasn't until the 1950s, under a politically motivated campaign by the Communist Party, that traditional medicine was actively revived. Not in spite of its clash with science, but exactly because the government found Western science orthodoxy to be bourgeois. And while potentially flawed in its motivations, this enforced plurality became the unlikely condition under which a modern government funded research on ancient information. So the cure for malaria didn't emerge from the self-correcting power of science. It emerged from a moment when an outside authority forced science to concede its monopoly on what counts as knowledge. Cool story, right? The next one's even better, but before I tell it, I'm gonna take a minute to shamelessly market myself because wow, this is like literally my whole job right now. This channel is made possible by recurring donations from the members of my Patreon, who, in addition to getting the satisfaction of supporting work they seem to think is valuable, get access to a whole bunch of stuff I don't post on YouTube. The Patreon is where I post updates on projects, share interviews with other creators and academics, and answer questions my viewers have for me. Cause I sure as hell am not out here replying to randos in the comment section for free. Patreon is also where I run my book club, which is where we read books about science, philosophy, radical education, or whatever it is I feel interested in. Right now, we're in the middle of reading Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and as interesting as this book is on its own, I've really loved getting to read the discussions that patrons are having about it at the same time. So if any of those perks sound fun, or perhaps you just enjoy my videos enough to want to help me keep making them, you can join the Patreon for as little as $3 a month at the link in the description. And of course, thank you so much to those of you who are already there. It's really great to be able to support myself through whatever it is that I'm building with y'all and not shilling for some AI product that you definitely don't need. And now what you're really here for, my defense of science humoring literal magic. So this example is the most out there of the three, but it's also what inspired all of this, so we're talking about it. My last video was about this guy, Paul Feyerabend's philosophy of scientific anarchism, and a big point he makes is that the ideas that are useful to science can come from anywhere, including myths and legends that seem patently unscientific. And in the book where he explains this point, he shares a criticism he'd previously received where someone basically asked him sarcastically, "If all knowledge is useful, are you saying we should go back and see what modern scientists can learn from voodoo?" To which Feyerabend iconically counters that non-scientific knowledge often only seems like nonsense because the scientists looking at it don't actually understand it enough to evaluate it. And this critic's ignorance of voodoo is an excellent example because apparently, voodoo has a firm, though still not sufficiently understood material basis, and a study of its manifestations can be used to enrich, and perhaps even to revise, our knowledge of physiology. Needless to say, I immediately looked up all the papers in the relevant footnote, spent a day going down one of the most fascinating rabbit holes of my life, and now here we are. Me, a former astrophysicist who's about to earnestly talk about magic killing spells in public, and you, the people who decided that watching her would be a good use of your time. Who's worse off? I don't know, man, but we're in it together now. So psychosomatic death is a real, scientifically validated phenomenon where, in reaction to extreme fear, people just die. It's been documented across cultures and levels of social development, in contexts ranging from prisoners of war or concentration camps who see no way out, to medical patients who had been given false positive terminal diagnoses. But the phenomenon was first introduced to science based on a slightly different context: voodoo curses. In 1942, Walter B. Cannon, the American physiologist most famous for coining the term fight or flight response, published a paper that compiled anthropologists' accounts from around the world of individuals dying after believing they had been cursed. Now, there's some variation in the accounts. Sometimes it was a direct curse, often in the form of bone pointing. Other times, it was someone realizing after the fact that they had violated a taboo, like eating from a special tree. Sometimes death came within hours, other times it took several days, and sometimes the victim was isolated, while other times they were surrounded by a community that reinforced the belief in the curse. But across cases, there were undeniably consistent beats. After becoming convinced that death was inevitable, the cursed victim would succumb to intense fear and hopelessness, stop eating and drinking, and physically deteriorate until they passed. fast. And no, the food and water avoidance isn't what actually killed them. The wildest part is, while there were several cases where Western doctors tried and failed to cure people in the process of voodoo dying, in cases where the shaman or whoever did the cursing for some reason lifted the curse, the victim made a full recovery. So Cannon looks at all these accounts, thinks there clearly must be something to this whole voodoo death thing, and makes an attempt to physiologically explain how an intense enough feeling of fear could possibly lead to death. He drew from his earlier work on emotions and physiology, which must have been why he was so willing to take this phenomenon seriously, because this man was most definitely in the minority. In the same paper, Cannon described how the attitude towards these accounts varied across disciplines. The ethnologists recognized the consistency across their accounts and conceded that people who believe they've been cursed to die do seem to die. But the doctors and physiologists, who had, by the way, never interacted with the communities this happened in, generally assumed this was an impossibility and that people are probably just lying. And it's not surprising that scientists dismiss these accounts outright because, once again, science has biases that inform which ideas seem reasonable to entertain. In this case, the limiting bias is the assumption of mind-body dualism, or the idea that the mind and the body are fundamentally separate things. This separation actually played a key historical role in medicine. By drawing a line between the abstract mind and the physical body, science was able to claim authority over anatomy and physiology by ceding authority over the soul to religion. And while that division gave medicine in Europe space to grow free from the oversight of the church, it also introduced a blind spot. If you're operating on the premise that the mind and body are separate, it's very hard to believe that something mental, like belief or fear, could possibly cause any physical effect, let alone one as extreme as death. And you might be thinking, I can hear a plane and a train and a car at the same time right now. And it's just like, why do people need to go so many places? Just stay home. And you might be thinking, well, sure, at one point we thought like that, but doesn't the modern understanding of physiology account for things like the mind-body connection and psychosomatic disorders? Yes, it does, in large part due to the groundbreaking work of one Walter B. Cannon. Here's how a 2002 retrospective in the American Journal of Public Health describes the legacy of that seminal work on voodoo death. At first glance, it is surprising that scientific discoveries over the last 60 years have largely filled out the details of, but not overturned, most of Cannon's proposed explanation of the physiological underpinnings of this phenomenon. On the other hand, it is not surprising when one considers the fact that Cannon's research formed the basis for much of our modern understanding of the physiological response systems. So Cannon's work was a catalyst in a critical paradigm shift for the Western understanding of how humans fundamentally function. And making that corrective shift hinged on him taking seriously anecdotal reports of a backwards myth from primitive societies. Now, I'm wary of giving Cannon too much credit here because reading the dehumanizing way he talked about the people he gained this knowledge from was low-key disgusting. But to give credit where it's due, Cannon, like Kimmerer and Tu, acted as a bridge between science and something else that ultimately led the former in an important direction it wouldn't have gone on its own. So to that critic of Feyerabend who mocked his philosophy for suggesting the potential value of voodoo, might I suggest some somatic exercises to process the emotional stress of being so aggressively checked? Before we wrap up, I want to clarify some points I anticipate pushback on. First up, isn't arguing for the validity of pseudoscience just opening the door to dangerous misinformation? No, and nuance won't kill you, I promise. Many, many things fall under any of the several definitions you could use for pseudoscience, and recognizing the value of some of it isn't the same as implicitly accepting all of it. So in the interest of not throwing out the baby with the epistemic bathwater, please miss me with, but blah 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 pseudoscience is a dangerous grift. I might agree with you, I might not, but either way, it has very little bearing on what I'm trying to say here. So am I saying that science is bad? No! What did I just say about the nuance? Science is awesome and does incredible things. But it can be extremely useful while still having limitations, because at the end of the day, it's people doing it. And people are fallible. Some guys in Europe idealized human observation as possibly being observer independent, flattened complex systems with emergent properties to the sum of their parts, and asserted that the rational mind transcends the messy materiality of the body. And in doing so, they set up an epistemic framework that is unequipped to recognize truths that don't conform to those narrow terms, which, as we've seen, do exist. So ironically, it's the exact ideals that Enlightenment fanboys hold up as the reason science isn't biased that, in fact, largely comprise its bias. Now, some will say, sure, historically, these biases existed, but past mistakes aren't damning because science is self-correcting. And I'll grant that science does get corrected, but believing it's fully self-correcting is honestly pretty cute in its optimism. Like, I see physics bros simping for the scientific method and just think, bless their hearts. No matter how rigorous we try to be, unnoticed incorrect assumptions can be unwittingly baked into the premises of an idea or even a whole knowledge system, such that its justification has an invisible circularity to it. And the only way to escape that loop is to introduce a seemingly incompatible perspective so that your limiting assumption can come out in contrast. This is one of the central points of my last video and the book it was based on, so if you want to get a more comprehensive explanation, you can go check that out. But the stories I shared today thoroughly illustrate something that I only alluded to there. That decidedly non-scientific knowledge systems can make unique and valuable contributions to the progression of science. As a quick aside, I like to give my viewers a discussion question at the end of each video to continue the conversation, and today I'm curious if any of y'all have any other examples of this. Drop it in the comments with the keywords discussion prompt if you do, and I'll share some in the outro of my next video. And one of the comments I got on the last one is actually quite relevant here. I had quickly given the example of fire management methods in North America and how the practices of indigenous communities clearly outperform the scientific methods the government imposed on their land. And someone said something along the lines of, well, if they learned whatever method through generations of observation and trial and error, shouldn't we just count that as a scientific process? And like, you could frame this conversation that way. I think that's a fair point to make. But what I'm more interested in here is why Kimmerer's colleagues felt it was reasonable to dismiss her student's thesis proposal as obviously not worthwhile by saying, and I quote, I don't find this whole traditional knowledge thing very convincing. I'm not gonna get into it now, but y'all do realize that there's a racial dimension to this, right? Like, it's not a coincidence that all the other knowledge systems come from non-white cultures. And we know that whose knowledge making is taken seriously and whose isn't is a part of how patriarchal white supremacist colonial capitalism maintains itself. Y'all are smart. I'm sure you made the connection. Coming from the position of someone trained to think solely within the paradigms of Western science, entertaining the potential value in Chinese medicine or voodoo isn't even a reasonable consideration. And far too often, that attitude is culturally held up as a testament to someone's intellectual rigor. But in all the stories we looked at, that attitude functioned as a barrier to understanding something important, and an alternative perspective was needed to overcome it. And therein lies the main takeaway here. Scientists remaining uncurious to things on the other side of the demarcation line is limiting, because the knowledge that is useful to science can come from anywhere. The methods of science are clearly very useful, but it is only one of many approaches to generating knowledge, and like any of these many approaches, it has its unique strengths and weaknesses. And I think letting them be in conversation with each other is the best way to understand as much of our reality as possible. So I don't want to figure out, like, which way is the best way so that we can elevate that way at the expense of all the other ways. I want to get all the ways talking to each other. I want more scholars like Kimmerer, who are experts in multiple knowledge systems and can translate between them. I want more programs like Project 523 to revive cultural practices that have been marginalized by modernization. I want more white guys like Cannon who are willing to take seriously the anecdotal accounts of primitive people and their experiences. I'm not saying accept all pseudoscience outright. I just want us to leave space for some open-mindedness. And not the kind of open-mindedness that only entertains an idea once it's been validated by peer review, or, even worse, rushes to debunk it with a study that completely misunderstands what it's testing. I mean the kind of open-mindedness that meets unfamiliar knowledge with curiosity and humility, even if the journals haven't signed off yet. Like, yeah, skepticism is important, But you gotta wonder how much we're missing out on by dismissing whole lines of inquiry out of hand, you know? How many truths have been buried because they couldn't yet speak the language science was trained to hear? So on the one hand, I do hope this presentation grounded your conception of science's power in a bit more realism than before. But on the other, less dunk-interested hand, I hope this inspires you to open up just a little, with healthy skepticism and caution, of course, to other ways of knowing things. Because while there are certainly all manner of grifters who will abuse trust to twist the truth, you can't convince me that there's not still a ton of valuable knowledge floating around out there that science just hasn't caught up to yet. Some that it might never catch up to. And I don't know about you, but I'm more interested in learning things than defending my personal favorite way of learning things. Anyways, that's all I got. Hope you learned something. Welcome to the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. In a second here, I'm gonna share some of the comments I got on my last video, but before that, you know what I gotta do. Please like the video, leave a comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. As of recording, I'm at like 99k subs, so if we could just like, you know, get me that silver plaque that I will put in a drawer. Or if you really wanted to help a girl out, you could join the Patreon, like these lovely people. They're great, I'm sure. Okay, comments time. So for context, if you didn't see it, the last video, which I did mention somewhat in this one, was about this guy Paul Feyerabend and his philosophy of anarchistic science. And his whole point is that like the scientific method is kind of bullshit, and in order for science to progress, it can't really be limited to any one specific methodology. I asked a few different questions about the video for the discussion, but the one I was most intrigued by the answers to was, what would it look like in practice if we adopted Feyerabend's philosophy? And some people said something like, well, doesn't this question kind of miss the point because, as you and Feyerabend both argued, science already is really messy and complicated and not fully represented by the scientific method as people understand it. But I don't think that means that his philosophy couldn't perhaps inspire leaning into that messiness a little more. And I'm gonna share 3 other comments that I think get at that. So the first one is from Mrayef, who talks about this in terms of how scientific findings are disseminated. For one, I imagine academic publishing in a world organized around Feyerabend's principles would look less like Elsevier and more like Sci-Hub. I also think there would be a more streamlined pathway for communicating new discoveries to the public than we have. I don't think we need to do away with the densely worded and rigorous/replicable laying out of procedures that we use in modern journal papers, but I like to dream about a world where every new paper gets some entry in some more accessible database for the broader public. Those are all great points. If people don't know what Sci-Hub is, go look up Sci-Hub because it is an excellent resource that I think does a lot to democratize science. Shout out to whoever it is who runs that. And I think it's super interesting to think about different ways of disseminating results. I think both for communicating among scientists and from scientists to the public, that people could be a lot more creative in thinking about what is actually important to communicate and how best to organize results. The next 2 actually relate quite well to today's topic. At Jimage132 says, I think that a valuable aspect of applying Feyerabend's ideas is to avoid using the scientific method to test non-Western knowledges, but instead as a supplement, where both have many important values, especially for things like land stewardship. For a recent example, the residents in East Palestine, Ohio, after the 2023 train derailment had clear personal knowledge and experience indicating the air, water, and soil were all poisoned. The EPA came to test for toxins, but found the toxin levels safe, even though residents, investigators, and responders got sick. Environmental justice communities, especially racialized environmental justice communities, have always had to contend with Western science showing that this or that entity is polluting at safe levels. This forces them to spend years to decades and so much money just to prove through the scientific method that they're suffering from the things they already knew they were suffering from, just so they can take adequate proof to policymakers, judges, and community members. That's an excellent point. It reminds me of a lot of research in education about whatever social dynamics that, from where I'm standing, it feels like we should just take people's experiences as assumed to be true and then investigate around that rather than trying to investigate whether or not people are actually experiencing what they say they're experiencing, you know? And the last comment is also very relevant to today's topic. So Nathan3827 says, so a cool research project I heard about at a conference on science communication came from a research team at a South African telescope. At some point, they made a book together with local communities on the medical properties of local plant life. The method they used to determine what knowledge on a particular plant was true was not based on rejection, but instead on consensus. They basically presented a plant to different elders from different local tribes and asked them what they knew about it. If several different tribe elders gave a similar story on the health benefits, then it would be more likely that this is not just a local superstition, but actually some knowledge Western medicine doesn't contain. I wonder if similar principles can be applied to other fields and communities. Today I heard about a project at my research institute, a medical hospital, where they are having stakeholders be a part of designing the research questions and experimental design. What a perfectly relevant example. I love how well the comments dovetailed into the conversation we had today. I'm particularly interested in that last part about medical research that's incorporating the perspectives of the people it will serve in designing the experiments. It reminds me of Dr. Devin Prince, the Dr. Devin Prince that does public health, not the Dr. Devin Prince that does psychology. Something I would see her do is ask her viewers questions that would help her design a survey instrument that was used in whatever public health research about STIs or something. It's so cool to see somebody who's so clearly a scientist and a public servant doing right by both of those roles in a very well incorporated way that just makes a lot of sense. So thank you for sharing that really interesting example, Nathan. And thank you of course to the other commenters who I shared the words of, as well as everybody who left a comment at all. I really do always love reading through what people have to say and have such a hard time picking just a couple to share with y'all. But these credits aren't that long though, so we're done now. Bye.